In the shadows of Ravencross Vale lies a story that will leave you questioning everything you believe. When a mysterious priest touches a dying girl at Mercy Haven Sanctum, what happens next sends shockwaves through the medical community and beyond. This is not just another miracle story. What unfolds in those sterile hospital halls will make you wonder about the thin line between faith, science, and forces we can't explain. Remember to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because this story will keep you on the edge of your seat until the very end. Thunder rolled across Ravencross Vale like a demon's growl, casting shadows that danced eerily across the ancient stone walls of Mercy Haven Sanctum. The hospital, a gothic masterpiece of Victorian architecture, loomed against the purple-bruised sky like a sentinel guarding terrible secrets. Its spires pierced the storm clouds as lightning illuminated stained glass windows that had witnessed countless battles between life and death. Nurse Astraea Wolfrik stood at the window of the pediatric intensive care unit, her reflection ghostly against the rain-streaked glass. 15 years of nursing had hardened her to most tragedies, but something about room 1313 had shaken her to her core. Behind her, machines beeped in rhythm with young Zephyra Moonshadow's failing heart, each sound a countdown to what seemed inevitable. The girl lay still as death itself, her once vibrant copper hair now dull against the sterile white pillows. Tubes and wires created a twisted web around her small frame, modern medicine's last desperate attempt to keep her tethered to this world. Callista Moonshadow, her mother, sat beside the bed, her fingers tracing patterns on her daughter's pale hand, whispering prayers to any deity who would listen. "Her vitals are dropping again," Dr. Theron Nightshade announced, his voice carrying the weight of too many lost battles. The hospital director ran his fingers through his silver-streaked hair, dark eyes fixed on the monitors. "We've tried everything in our power, Mrs. Moonshadow. I'm so sorry, but you might want to." "No!" Callista's voice cracked like the lightning outside. "She's not going anywhere. There has to be something else. Someone else." Her eyes, red-rimmed from sleepless nights, darted between the doctor and nurse. What about Father Salvatore?" The name sent a chill down Astraea's spine. Father Cyprian Salvatore, the newest addition to the hospital's chaplaincy service. There were already whispers about him in the hospital corridors, stories that seemed too fantastic to be true. Some called him a miracle worker, others a harbinger of strange events. "Mrs. Moonshadow," Dr. Nightshade began cautiously. "Father Salvatore is not a medical professional. In Zephyra's condition, call him." Callista's voice had changed, carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "Please, before it's too late." Astraea exchanged glances with Dr. Nightshade. The hospital director's face was a mask of professional concern, but something flickered in his eyes. Was it fear? "I'll page Sister Celine," he said finally. "She'll know where to find him." The minutes crawled by like hours. The storm outside intensified, and the lights in the corridor flickered ominously. Nurse Isolde Ravenwing appeared at the door, her usually stern face marked with concern. "He's coming," she whispered to Astraea. "Heaven help us all." The temperature in room 1313 seemed to drop several degrees. The hair on Astraea's arms stood on end as footsteps echoed down the corridor, steady, measured, inevitable. Even the machine's beeping seemed to fade into an eerie silence. Father Cyprian Salvatore appeared in the doorway like a figure from another time. Tall and gaunt, his black cassock made him seem more shadow than man. His eyes burned with an intensity that made Astraea want to look away but couldn't. They were the color of Arctic ice, holding secrets darker than the storm outside. "You called for me," he said, his voice carrying an accent Astraea couldn't quite place. Ancient, otherworldly. Callista rushed to him, grabbing his hands. "Please, Father, my daughter. She's all I have." Father Salvatore's gaze moved to Zephyra, and something changed in his expression. The machines monitoring her vitals began to behave erratically, displays flickering with impossible readings. "Everyone out," he commanded softly. "Now wait just a minute, Doctor." Nightshade began, but the priest turned those Arctic eyes on him. You've done all you can with your science, Doctor. Now it's time for something older, something your instruments can't measure. He moved to Zephyra's bedside, placing one pale hand on her forehead. Though you may wish to stay and witness what happens next, it might change everything you think you know about the boundaries between life and death. Astraea felt it then, a current in the air, like electricity, but different, wrong. The storm outside reached a crescendo, and every light in the hospital flickered simultaneously. As Father Salvatore began to pray in a language that had died before Rome was built, Zephyra's body arched off the bed like a puppet on invisible strings. And what happened next would haunt everyone in room 1313 for the rest of their lives. The machines surrounding Zephyra's bed erupted in a cacophony of alarms, their screens displaying readings that defied medical explanation. Dr. Theron Nightshade rushed forward, his professional composure cracking as he watched numbers spike and plummet in impossible patterns. "This isn't possible," he muttered, his hands hovering uselessly over the equipment. Nurse Astraea Wolfrik stood frozen, watching as Father Salvatore's prayer grew more intense. His words, ancient and guttural, seemed to resonate with the storm raging outside. The temperature in room 1313 plunged so low that their breath became visible in the air, crystallizing like delicate spider webs before dissipating. Callista Moonshadow pressed herself against the wall, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and horror as she watched her daughter's body continue to arch unnaturally. "What's happening to her?" she whispered, but no one answered. No one could. The lights in the room began to pulse in rhythm with Father Salvatore's words, creating shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. Nurse Isolde Ravenwing burst into the room, drawn by the chaos of alarms. "Dear God," she breathed, crossing herself instinctively. "Don't." Father Salvatore's command cut through the chaos like a knife. "Do not invoke him. Not yet." His eyes remained fixed on Zephyra, his hand still pressed against her forehead. The girl's skin had taken on an otherworldly luminescence, pale blue veins visible beneath like rivers of light. Suddenly, Zephyra's eyes snapped open, but they were not the warm brown eyes her mother knew. They blazed with an intense white light that filled the room with its radiance. When she spoke, her voice was not her own. "You dare!" The voice emanated from her small frame, deep and resonant, carrying echoes of countless others. "You dare to interfere with the natural order, Cyprian?" Father Salvatore's face remained impassive, though sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold. "I dare to challenge any order that takes children before their time," he responded, his accent thickening with each word. Dr. Nightshade moved toward the door, his scientific mind struggling to process what he was witnessing. "This isn't. We need to call." "You will call no one," Father Salvatore commanded without looking away from Zephyra. "What happens in this room must remain here. The consequences otherwise would be severe." Nurse Astraea found her voice at last. "Father, what have you done? What is happening to her?" The priest's response was cut short as Zephyra's body suddenly went rigid. The voice that emerged from her throat spoke in that same ancient language Father Salvatore had used, each word causing the medical equipment to spark and malfunction. Sister Selene Duskwind appeared in the doorway, her normally serene face tight with concern. "Father, the other patients, and they're all experiencing strange symptoms. The entire ward is in chaos." "Close the door," Father Salvatore ordered. "Now." His voice carried such authority that Sister Selene complied immediately, sealing them all in with whatever force had taken hold of young Zephyra. The storm outside reached a new level of intensity, lightning striking so close that the building shook to its foundations. In that brilliant flash, Astraea could have sworn she saw something else in the room. Shadows that shouldn't exist, forms that defied description, gathering around Zephyra's bed like spectral vultures. "What do you want?" Father Salvatore demanded of the entity speaking through Zephyra. "Name your price." A laugh echoed through the room, but it held no warmth, no humanity. "Price?" You know better, Cyprian. This is not about bargaining, this is about balance. The girl's time has come. You, of all people, should understand the consequences of disrupting the natural order. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Callista pushed herself away from the wall, moving toward her daughter despite Dr. Nightshade's attempt to hold her back. "Please," she begged. "She's just a child. Take me instead. Please." The entity turned Zephyra's glowing eyes toward her mother. "Such love," it mused, the multiple voices becoming more distinct. "Such devotion, but love alone cannot change what must be." Father Salvatore's grip on Zephyra's forehead tightened, and his next words carried a power that made the air itself seem to vibrate. "You speak of balance," he said, his voice gaining strength. "But you know as well as I that there are older laws than even that, laws written before time itself began." The entity went silent, and for a moment, the only sound was the storm and the erratic beeping of the few machines that still functioned. When it spoke again, there was a note of curiosity in its ancient voice. "You would invoke those laws? Here? Now? After what happened the last time?" "I would," Father Salvatore replied without hesitation. "And this time, I am prepared for the cost." Nurse Astraea watched in stunned fascination as the priest began to change before her eyes. His skin seemed to become translucent, revealing something beneath that her mind couldn't, or wouldn't, process. The temperature dropped even further, frost forming on the windows and creeping across the floor. Dr. Nightshade moved to check Zephyra's vitals, but his hands passed through the medical equipment as if it wasn't there. "This isn't happening," he muttered. "This can't be happening." "Oh, but it is," Sister Celine whispered, her eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before them. "And heaven help us all if he fails." The tension in room 1313 had reached a breaking point, and as Father Salvatore prepared to invoke laws older than time itself, everyone present knew they were about to witness something that would either save Zephyra's life or doom them all to consequences beyond their comprehension. The frost creeping across room 1313's floor began to take on impossible patterns, ancient symbols that burned themselves into the consciousness of everyone present. Dr. Theron Nightshade found himself unconsciously backing away from them, his scientific mind rebelling against what his eyes witnessed. The symbols seemed to pulse with their own internal light, casting an eerie blue glow that competed with the otherworldly radiance still emanating from Zephyra's eyes. "The old laws," Father Salvatore continued, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to make the very air vibrate, "speak of equivalent exchange, a life for a life, a soul for a soul." His form continued to shift and change, becoming increasingly difficult to look at directly, as if he existed in multiple places at once. The entity speaking through Zephyra laughed again, the sound like breaking glass. "And whose life do you offer, priest? Whose soul would you trade for this child's?" Nurse Astraea Wolfrik felt her heart stop as Father Salvatore smiled, a terrible, knowing smile that held no warmth. "Mine," he said simply, "but not in the way you expect." The entity's curiosity was palpable, causing the medical equipment to emit strange, discordant tones. "Explain." "Not my death," Father Salvatore clarified, his arctic eyes now glowing with the same intensity as Zephyra's. "But my purpose, my calling, everything I am." Sister Celine gasped, understanding dawning on her face. "Father, no! You can't!" But Salvatore continued as if he hadn't heard her. "I offer my priesthood, my connection to the divine, everything I have built over centuries of service." His words seemed to carry physical weight, pressing everyone in the room back against the walls. The entity was silent for a long moment. When it spoke again, the multiple voices had merged into one, ancient, powerful, and intrigued. "You would give up your immortal service? The power and purpose granted to you after the Great Plague? You would become mortal?" Callista Moonshadow looked between her daughter and the priest, confusion warring with desperate hope on her face. "Centuries? What are you talking about?" Father Salvatore isn't what you think he is, Sister Celine explained softly, her eyes never leaving the priest. He's one of the eternal servants, chosen during the Black Death to walk between worlds, guiding souls and maintaining the balance between life and death. There are only 7 of them left. Dr. Nightshade shook his head violently. This is insane. We need to be silent, Father Salvatore commanded, and the doctor found himself physically unable to speak. The exchange must be witnessed, but not interrupted. He turned his attention back to the entity possessing Zephyra. You know my offer is more than sufficient. 1 immortal servant's power in exchange for 1 mortal life. The balance would be maintained. The entity seemed to consider this, causing Zephyra's body to float several inches above the bed. The shadows in the room began to coalesce into distinct shapes, robed figures that might have been human once, long ago. They moved around the bed in a slow, deliberate circle. The consequences would be significant, the entity mused. You would age, die. Your knowledge of the ancient ways would fade. All your power, all your purpose, gone. And for what? 1 child. Every child is worth saving, Father Salvatore replied without hesitation. I have watched too many slip away over the centuries. Not this one. Not today. Nurse Astraea found herself moving forward, drawn by a compulsion she couldn't explain. Wait, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. There has to be another way. The entity turned Zephyra's glowing eyes toward her, and Astraea felt as if her very soul was being examined. The nurse speaks out of turn, it said, sounding almost amused. But perhaps, yes, perhaps there is wisdom here. Father Salvatore's expression sharpened. What do you propose? The entity caused Zephyra's body to rotate slowly in the air, the shadowy figures around the bed moving faster now. Instead of your entire being, Cyprian, what if we took only half? You would retain some of your power, some of your purpose, but you would also begin to age, slowly but surely. And in exchange? In exchange? Father Salvatore prompted. In exchange, the girl lives. But she too will be changed. She will see what you see, know what you know. She will walk between worlds as you do, bearing the burden of knowledge no child should carry. Callista surged forward. No, you can't do that to her. The choice is not yours, the entity replied coldly. It is hers. It turned Zephyra's glowing eyes to Father Salvatore. What say you, eternal servant? Half your power, half your immortality in exchange for her life, though it will never be the same. The shadows around the bed had become so dense they were almost solid, their robed forms now clearly visible to everyone in the room. Sister Celine began to pray, her whispered words carrying their own kind of power, creating a counterpoint to the ancient energies swirling through the room. Father Salvatore closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, they blazed with renewed purpose. I accept, he said, his voice resonating with finality. Let it be done. The entity's laugh filled the room one final time. Then, let the exchange begin. What happened next would be seared into the memories of everyone present until their dying day. Father Salvatore's form began to split, as if he were being torn in two. Light poured from his body, arcing across the room to connect with Zephyra. The shadowy figures raised their arms in unison, their voices joining in a chant that made reality itself seem to bend and warp. Dr. Nightshade collapsed to his knees, his hands pressed against his ears, while Nurse Astraea found herself rooted to the spot, unable to look away from the impossible scene unfolding before her. The exchange had begun, and nothing would ever be the same. The exchange of power between Father Salvatore and Zephyra transformed Room 1313 into something beyond mortal understanding. Reality seemed to fold in on itself as streams of ethereal energy flowed between the priest and the young girl. The shadowy figures continued their ancient chant, their voices resonating at frequencies that made the very atoms in the air vibrate. Nurse Astraea Wolfrik watched in horrified fascination as Father Salvatore's appearance began to shift. The timeless quality that had made him seem ageless moments before began to fade. Lines appeared around his eyes, his hair streaked with gray, as if years were catching up to him in minutes. Yet his eyes, those arctic pools of ancient knowledge, remained as intense as ever, fixed unwaveringly on Zephyra. "The process cannot be interrupted," Sister Celine warned as Dr. Nightshade struggled to his feet, his scientific instincts still fighting to take control of the situation. Any interference now could destroy them both. The entity speaking through Zephyra suddenly let out a sound that was neither laugh nor scream, but something in between. The girl's body arched impossibly as the transfer of power reached its peak. Light poured from her eyes, her mouth, even her fingertips, creating patterns in the air that burned themselves into the observer's retinas. "Something's wrong," Callista cried out, pressing herself against the wall as the temperature in the room plunged even lower. "You're hurting her." But Father Salvatore's voice cut through the chaos, though his physical form seemed to be unraveling at the edges. "No," he gasped. "She's fighting to maintain her innocence against the weight of ancient knowledge. Help her, Mrs. Moonshadow, remind her who she is." Callista pushed away from the wall, maternal instinct overcoming her fear. She reached for her daughter's hand despite the crackling energy surrounding the girl. "Zephyra, sweetie, listen to me. Remember the stories we read together? The songs we sing? Remember who you are, my little moonflower. Come back to me." The shadowy figures circling the bed paused in their chant, their hooded heads turning toward Callista. The entity's voice emerged from Zephyra once more, but it seemed different now, uncertain, almost vulnerable. "The mother's love. It interferes with the transfer." This was not part of the bargain. "Love is older than any of your laws," Sister Celine declared, her quiet voice carrying surprising authority. "It existed before the balance, before the eternal servants, before death itself. You cannot deny its power." Nurse Astraea found herself moving forward, drawn by an instinct she couldn't explain. Her years of medical training seemed insignificant in the face of what was happening, but something deeper, something more primal told her she had a role to play. She reached for Zephyra's other hand, completing a circuit with Callista. The moment she made contact, images flooded her mind. Centuries of history seen through Father Salvatore's eyes, countless deaths and rebirths, the weight of knowledge no mortal was meant to bear. She understood now what they were trying to save Zephyra from. "Focus on her," Astraea called out to Callista. "Focus on the little girl who loves strawberry ice cream and silly jokes, the one who draws butterflies in the margins of her school books. Hold on to that, Zephyra." Dr. Nightshade watched in astonishment as the chaos in the room began to take on a new pattern. The medical equipment, which had been displaying impossible readings, started to show recognizable vitals. Weak, but present. Real. "The balance shifts," the entity announced, its multiple voices becoming distinct again. This was not foreseen. The girl's humanity. It anchors her to this world even as she accepts the ancient knowledge. Most unusual. Father Salvatore managed a smile despite his obvious pain. "Children. Always surprising us," he gasped. His form had solidified somewhat, though he looked decades older than he had at the start of the exchange. Perhaps this is why the old laws needed to change. The shadowy figures resumed their chant, but the tone had changed. What had been threatening now seemed almost harmonious. The frost patterns on the floor began to recede, and the oppressive weight in the air started to lift. "A new balance," the entity mused through Zephyra. "Not what was intended, but acceptable. The exchange is complete." With those words, the supernatural light left Zephyra's eyes, and she collapsed back onto the bed. The shadowy figures faded away one by one, their chant lingering in the air like smoke. Father Salvatore staggered, caught by Sister Celine before he could fall. "Zephyra." Callista's voice trembled as she stroked her daughter's face. "Baby, can you hear me?" Slowly, Zephyra's eyes fluttered open. They were her own warm brown again, but there was something else there now. A depth that hadn't existed before, a knowledge that seemed both ancient and new. She looked at her mother, then at Nurse Astraea, and finally at Father Salvatore. I understand now, she whispered, her voice hoarse but her own. I see. Everything. Father Salvatore straightened up with Sister Selena's help, his now aged face gentle. Not everything, child. Just enough. The knowledge will come gradually, as you grow. Your mother's love and Nurse Wolfrik's compassion have anchored you to this world in a way none of us expected. You will walk between worlds, but you will never lose yourself to them. Dr. Nightshade approached the bed cautiously, checking the monitors with trembling hands. Her vitals are stabilizing, he announced, his voice filled with wonder. Whatever just happened, she's healing. The storm outside had begun to calm, but everyone in room 1313 knew that this was just the beginning. Something unprecedented had occurred. A new kind of balance had been struck between the ancient and the modern, between life and death, between love and law. Dawn crept over Ravencross Vale like a tentative whisper, painting the gothic spires of Mercy Haven Sanctum in shades of rose and gold. Room 1313, which hours before had been the epicenter of supernatural forces beyond comprehension, now sat in an almost uncomfortable normalcy. The only evidence of the night's events were the lingering frost patterns on the windows and the inexplicable age that now marked Father Salvatore's once timeless features. Nurse Astraea Wolfrik moved through her morning duties with mechanical precision, though her hands trembled slightly as she checked Zephyra's vitals. The girl slept peacefully now, her face serene, showing no sign of the otherworldly presence that had possessed her just hours before. But there were changes, subtle ones that only someone looking closely would notice. Zephyra's copper hair now held strands of silver, like moonlight woven into flame. Her skin seemed to hold a faint luminescence, as if light resided just beneath the surface. Even in sleep, her eyes moved rapidly beneath their lids, as if watching scenes invisible to others. Her readings are remarkable, Dr. Theron Nightshade murmured, reviewing the charts with bloodshot eyes. He hadn't left the hospital since the exchange, too fascinated and terrified by what he had witnessed to step away. The disease that was killing her. It's not just in remission, it's gone, completely, as if it never existed. Callista Moonshadow, who had refused to leave her daughter's bedside, looked up with eyes red from exhaustion and tears. But at what cost? She whispered. What has she become? Something new. Father Salvatore's voice came from the doorway. He stood there leaning heavily on a cane that Sister Celine had found for him, his newly aged frame requiring support. Something that has never existed before. A bridge between worlds, anchored by love rather than duty. Nurse Isolde Ravenwing appeared behind him, her stern face softened by concern. Father, you should be resting. The exchange took a tremendous toll on you. He waved away her concern, though the movement itself seemed to tire him. There will be time for rest later. Now we must prepare for what comes next. The girl will need guidance. As if in response to his words, Zephyra's eyes fluttered open. But instead of the confusion or fear they expected, her gaze was clear and focused. She looked around the room, seeing far more than just its physical contents. The shadows have faces, she said softly, her voice carrying an odd echo. They're not scary, though. They're just waiting. Lost. Her eyes fixed on Father Salvatore. Like the one behind you. She's been following you for a very long time. The priest nodded slowly, unsurprised. Her name was Maria. She died during the Great Plague. I was unable to save her, and she has reminded me of that failure ever since. Dr. Nightshade made a strangled sound in his throat. You can't seriously be suggesting that the dead walk among us. Zephyra turned her gaze to him, and the doctor took an involuntary step back. They always have, Doctor. Nightshade. You felt them here in the hospital. Every doctor does. Why do you think you sometimes know, without any medical reason, that a patient won't make it? Or why certain rooms feel colder than others no matter how much you adjust the temperature? Nurse Astraea found herself nodding. She had experienced exactly what Zephyra described countless times, but had always dismissed it as intuition or coincidence. Now she wondered how much else she had ignored over the years. "What you're saying," she began carefully, "is that death isn't just a moment. It's a presence, a force, a transition," Father Salvatore corrected gently. "And now, thanks to our unprecedented exchange, Zephyra will be able to help others make that transition when their time truly comes. Or, in some cases, help them stay when it's not their time." Callista gripped her daughter's hand tighter. "She's just a child. She can't be responsible for—" "Mom," Zephyra interrupted, squeezing her hand back. "I'm still me. I still love strawberry ice cream and silly jokes. I still want to draw butterflies and read stories with you. I just see more now. Know more. And I can help people." Sister Selene stepped forward, her serene face thoughtful. "The question is, how do we proceed from here? This situation is unprecedented. The hospital administration will want answers about Zephyra's miraculous recovery. Not to mention the other patients on the ward," Nurse Ravenwing added. "They all experienced strange phenomena during the exchange. Questions are already being asked." Dr. Nightshade ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "We could say it was a new experimental treatment, something classified. It wouldn't be the first time unusual methods have been used in desperate cases. Or," Zephyra suggested, her voice carrying that strange echo again, "we could tell the truth. Not all of it, but enough. Sometimes people need to believe in miracles even if they don't understand them." Father Salvatore smiled, the expression making the new lines on his face deepen. "Wisdom beyond your years, child. Though I suppose that's to be expected now." Suddenly, Zephyra's expression changed. She sat up straighter, her eyes fixed on something no one else could see. "Someone's coming," she announced. "Down the hall. Room 1108. They're not ready yet, but they're afraid." Nurse Astraea and Dr. Nightshade exchanged glances before both rushed out of the room. Moments later, alarms could be heard from the direction Zephyra had indicated, a patient in cardiac arrest. The sun had fully risen over Ravencross Vale now, bringing with it a new day and a new reality. In room 1313, a young girl with ancient knowledge in her eyes prepared to face a destiny none of them could have imagined, while outside, the normal routines of the hospital continued, unaware that the thin veil between life and death had been forever altered. The cardiac arrest in room 1108 marked the beginning of something extraordinary at Mercy Haven Sanctum. As Dr. Nightshade and Nurse Astraea rushed to respond to the emergency, Zephyra's voice followed them down the hallway, clear and commanding despite her physical distance. "He's not ready," she called out. "His grandson is coming from Seattle. He needs 3 more hours." The medical team found Mr. Harrison, an elderly patient recovering from pneumonia, in full cardiac arrest. As they began their standard procedures, something unusual happened. Despite all medical indicators suggesting the contrary, his heart continued beating weakly, defying the natural progression of death. "This is impossible," Dr. Nightshade muttered, checking the monitors for the 3rd time. "By all medical understanding, he should be living," Nurse Astraea finished firmly, remembering Zephyra's words. "He's living, doctor. Sometimes that's all we need to know." Back in room 1313, Zephyra sat cross-legged on her bed, her eyes closed but moving rapidly beneath the lids. Father Salvatore watched her with a mixture of pride and concern, his aged frame settled heavily in a chair beside her. "You must be careful," he warned gently. "Holding back death has consequences, even with our unique abilities." "I'm not holding it back," Zephyra replied, her eyes still closed. "I'm just negotiating. The shadows understand about family. They were family once too." Callista Moonshadow watched this exchange with growing unease. Her daughter spoke of death and shadows with a casualness that seemed wrong coming from a child's lips. Yet there was still something undeniably Zephyra in the way she tilted her head, in the small smile that played at the corners of her mouth. Sister Selene entered the room, her face grave. "The hospital board is convening an emergency meeting. They want explanations for last night's events. Multiple patients reported mysterious occurrences, lights flickering, Strange sounds, unexplained recoveries. Let them meet, Father Salvatore said wearily. Some things cannot be explained to those who are not ready to understand them. Nurse Isolde Ravenwing appeared in the doorway, her usually stern expression replaced with one of wonder. Mr. Harrison is stabilizing, she reported. And his grandson's flight just landed early. He'll be here within the hour. Zephyra opened her eyes, now swirling with hints of silver among their natural brown. See? Sometimes all we need is a little more time. Dr. Nightshade returned to room 1313, his medical coat rumpled and his face showing the strain of trying to reconcile what he knew with what he had witnessed. We need to talk about what happens next, he announced. The hospital can't simply ignore... He was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. Hospital security, led by Lazarus Crowley, approached with determined steps. Behind them came Dr. Thanatos Grimshaw, the emergency doctor who had first diagnosed Zephyra's terminal condition. This is highly irregular, Dr. Grimshaw declared as he entered the room. A terminal patient showing complete recovery overnight? Reports of supernatural phenomena throughout the ward? Dr. Nightshade, what exactly has been happening in this room? Before anyone could respond, Zephyra spoke, her voice carrying that otherworldly echo that made everyone pause. Your sister forgives you, Doctor. Grimshaw. The emergency doctor froze, his face draining of color. What did you say? Elena. The car accident when you were residents together. She knows it wasn't your fault that you were too tired to drive. She's been trying to tell you for years, but guilt blocks her voice. Dr. Grimshaw staggered backward, catching himself on the doorframe. How could you possibly know about Elena? The same way she knows about many things now, Father Salvatore interjected, rising slowly from his chair. Doctor, there are forces at work in this hospital, in this world, that medicine cannot explain. Sometimes we must simply accept that our understanding has limits. Lazarus Crowley, the security guard, shifted uncomfortably. Sir, we have orders from the board to secure this room and its occupants until a full investigation can be conducted. And how exactly? Nurse Astraea asked, stepping forward. Do you plan to investigate a miracle? The tension in the room was broken by a sudden cry from down the hall. A cry of joy. Mr. Harrison's grandson had arrived, rushing past the security detail to embrace his very much alive grandfather. Zephyra smiled. Some things don't need investigation, she said softly. They just need to be accepted. Like the fact that your daughter will call you tonight, Mr. Crowley. The estrangement is ending. She's ready to come home. The security guard's stern expression crumbled, tears forming in his eyes. One by one, those who had come to demand explanations found themselves confronted with truths they couldn't deny. Personal, impossible truths that spoke to their hearts rather than their minds. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Mercy Haven Sanctum, illuminating room 1313 and its occupants in a soft, forgiving light. As medical science and supernatural reality continued their delicate dance, it became clear that the changes brought about by the exchange were spreading far beyond just Zephyra and Father Salvatore. The hospital itself seemed to pulse with new energy, as if awakening to the deeper truths that had always existed within its walls. The afternoon at Mercy Haven Sanctum brought with it an atmosphere of surreal calm. Room 13. 13 had become an unofficial gathering place for those seeking answers to questions they never thought they'd ask. Dr. Thanatos Grimshaw sat slumped in a corner chair, his professional skepticism warring with the undeniable truth of Zephyra's knowledge about his sister Elena. You have to understand, he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. I've spent 15 years blaming myself for her death, 15 years of carrying that weight. Zephyra, who now sat surrounded by a collection of drawings she'd made, each one depicting scenes and faces only she could see, looked up from her work. She never blamed you. The shadows of the past only have the power we give them. Father Salvatore nodded from his position by the window, his newly aged face reflecting the wisdom of centuries. The girl speaks truth, though I suspect she sees it more clearly than I ever did, even with all my years of service. Nurse Astraea Wolfrik moved through the room, checking Zephyra's vitals. though she'd begun to wonder if such mundane medical procedures were even necessary anymore. The monitors showed readings that defied conventional medical understanding. Not dangerous, just different. Her brain activity is extraordinary, Dr. Nightshade observed, studying the latest readings. It's as if she's processing information from multiple sources simultaneously. Because I am, Zephyra replied matter-of-factly, adding another detail to her current drawing. This world and the other one. They're not as separate as people think. They're like two radio stations playing at once, and now I can hear them both. Callista Moonshadow, who had finally been convinced to get some rest in a nearby room, returned looking somewhat refreshed but still worried. And these stations? They don't frighten you, sweetheart? No, Mom, Zephyra smiled, reaching for her mother's hand. They're just different parts of the same song, like how you can hear the melody and the harmony in your favorite lullaby. Sister Celine entered the room, her serene facade showing cracks of concern. The hospital board is still in session. They're talking about bringing in outside experts, perhaps even government investigators. Let them come, Father Salvatore said quietly. They will find what they are ready to find, nothing more. Suddenly, Zephyra's hand stilled over her drawing. Her eyes took on that now familiar silver sheen as she turned toward the door. Someone's coming, someone who needs us. Moments later, Nurse Isolde Ravenwing appeared, supporting a young woman who looked to be in her early 20s. The woman's face was streaked with tears, her hospital gown indicating she was a patient. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I know this sounds crazy, but I heard there was a girl who could see, who could talk to your baby," Zephyra finished softly. "You want to know if he's at peace." The young woman's knees buckled, and Nurse Ravenwing helped her into a chair. "How did you—" "He's here," Zephyra said, already beginning a new drawing. "He wants you to know that the miscarriage wasn't your fault. Some souls. They need more time to prepare for the world. He'll come back to you, just not yet." Dr. Grimshaw stood abruptly. "This is the Reeves case from the maternity ward. How could you possibly know?" "Because she sees what we cannot," Father Salvatore interrupted. "What I once saw clearly, but now see only in glimpses, thanks to our exchange." Nurse Astraea watched as Zephyra completed her drawing, a perfect portrait of a baby boy with his mother's eyes, surrounded by a gentle light. The young woman took the drawing with trembling hands, pressing it to her heart as she wept. "The hospital is changing," Dr. Nightshade observed quietly. "Word is spreading. Patients are reporting dreams of loved ones, bringing messages of comfort. The terminal ward. The atmosphere there has completely transformed." "Because they can feel it too," Zephyra explained, starting another drawing. "The veil between worlds has always been thinnest in places of transition. Hospitals, where people move between life and death. Now it's just more noticeable." Sister Celine moved to stand beside Father Salvatore. "The exchange didn't just change Zephyra and you, did it? It changed the very nature of this place." "All great shifts create ripples," the priest replied, his aged hands gripping his cane tighter. "When the old laws bend, reality bends with them. Mercy Haven Sanctum will never be just a hospital again. It has become something more. A place where the seen and unseen worlds touch openly." Maven Blackthorn, the hospital receptionist, appeared at the door. "There's a growing crowd in the lobby," she reported nervously. "People saying they've heard about the miracle in room 1313. Some are crying, saying they can feel their departed loved ones near them." Zephyra looked up from her drawing, her face showing a wisdom far beyond her years. "They're not wrong. The shadows are gathering, but not to frighten. They've been waiting so long to be heard, to bring comfort to those they left behind." As the day progressed at Mercy Haven Sanctum, it became increasingly clear that the exchange between Father Salvatore and Zephyra had catalyzed something far greater than anyone had anticipated. The hospital stood at the threshold of a new era, where the boundaries between life and death, science and spirit, were no longer as rigid as they once seemed. Night settled over Mercy Haven Sanctum like a heavy velvet cloak, but sleep seemed a distant concept for those within its walls. The crowd in the lobby had grown despite the late hour, their collective presence creating an energy that hummed through the building's ancient stonework. Room 1313 remained the eye of this metaphysical storm, where Zephyra continued her drawings with an almost feverish intensity. "They're all connected," she murmured, her small hands moving swiftly across paper after paper. "Every story, every loss, every moment of grief, they're all threads in a bigger pattern." Father Salvatore watched from his chair, each hour seeming to add another year to his weathered face. "The pattern reveals itself," he said softly. "But at what cost?" Dr. Theron Nightshade burst into the room, his usual professional composure completely shattered. "The media's gotten hold of the story," he announced, running trembling fingers through his disheveled hair. "There are news vans gathering outside. Someone leaked footage from the security cameras." "Impossible," Nurse Astraea responded sharply. "The cameras went dead during the exchange. We all saw it." "Not all of them," Sister Celine interjected, her face grave. "The new system in the East Wing remained operational, though what it captured—" She trailed off, unable to find words to describe what the footage might show. Callista Moonshadow, who had been dozing in a chair beside her daughter's bed, jerked awake at the commotion. "We need to protect her," she said immediately, maternal instinct flaring. "She's still just a child." "Am I?" Zephyra asked, looking up from her drawings with eyes that swirled silver and brown. "I'm something else now, Mom. Something that's never existed before." She turned to Father Salvatore. "That's why they're gathering, isn't it? Not just the shadows, but the others. The ones who maintain the old ways." The priest nodded slowly, his arctic eyes clouding with concern. "The other eternal servants will come. They must. What we did, what we created, it challenges everything they've protected for centuries." Nurse Isolde Ravenwing appeared at the door, her stern face even more severe than usual. "Security reports unusual atmospheric conditions around the hospital. The temperature's dropping dramatically, and there's something like aurora lights in the sky." "They're here," Father Salvatore and Zephyra said in unison, their voices carrying that same otherworldly resonance. Dr. Thanatos Grimshaw, who had refused to leave despite the late hour, moved to the window. "Dear God," he whispered, his medical skepticism crumbling at the sight before him. The night sky above Mercy Haven Sanctum had come alive with ribbons of impossible light, not the gentle greens and blues of normal aurora, but deep purples and crimsons that seemed to pulse with purpose. The gathering crowd in the parking lot had fallen silent, all faces turned upward in wonder and fear. "How many?" Nurse Astraea asked Father Salvatore, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. 6, he replied heavily. "The remaining eternal servants, each chosen during humanity's darkest hours to maintain the balance between life and death. And now—" He looked at Zephyra with a mixture of pride and concern. "Now they come to judge what we have done." Zephyra set aside her drawings and sat up straighter in her bed. "They're afraid," she said, with surprising compassion. "They think what happened here threatens everything they've worked for. They don't understand that it's not an ending, but a beginning." Sister Celine moved to stand beside Father Salvatore, her quiet voice carrying steel. "What can we expect?" "They will try to undo it," he said grimly. "Return things to their proper order as they see it. They don't understand that some changes once made cannot be undone without destroying something precious." Dr. Nightshade straightened his lab coat, a futile gesture of normalcy in an increasingly abnormal situation. "What do we do? How do we protect?" But Zephyra cut him off, her voice suddenly carrying that ancient power they had come to recognize. "We don't fight them," she declared. "We show them." She turned to Father Salvatore. "The drawings, they're not just pictures, are they? They're proof." The priest's aged face broke into a smile of understanding. "Proof that the old laws can bend without breaking, that love and compassion can create new forms of balance." The crimson aurora continued to dance above Mercy Haven Sanctum as midnight approached, its light casting strange shadows through the windows of room 1313. Inside, a young girl with ancient knowledge in her eyes prepared to face the judgment of beings who had walked between worlds for centuries, while outside the crowd grew larger, drawn by an instinct they couldn't name to witness something that would challenge everything they believed about life, death, and the spaces in between. The temperature in Mercy Haven Sanctum plunged to impossible levels as 6 figures materialized in the main corridor leading to room 1313. Unlike the shadowy forms witnessed during the exchange, these beings walked with solid purpose, their ancient power manifesting in ways that defied physical laws. Frost patterns formed beneath their feet, and the modern hospital lighting flickered and died in their presence, replaced by an otherworldly glow that emanated from their very beings. "They're beautiful," Zephyra whispered, her silver-flecked eyes wide with wonder. Each one chosen from a different moment when humanity stood at the brink. Father Salvatore nodded, his aged frame straightening despite his weariness. The plague doctor, chosen during the Black Death. The war nurse who walked the battlefields of 100 conflicts. The child keeper, guardian of souls lost too young. The famine saint, who guided those who perished in times of great hunger. The storm watcher, chosen during the great floods. And he paused, his voice catching. The plague speaker, most ancient of us all. The door to room 1313 swung open without being touched. The 6 eternal servants entered with a presence that seemed to bend reality around them. Their forms shifted between ancient and modern dress, between youth and age, between solid and shadow. The plague doctor stepped forward first, his voice carrying echoes of centuries past. "Brother Cyprian, what have you done?" Nurse Astraea found herself backing against the wall, her medical training useless in the face of such ancient power. Dr. Nightshade and Dr. Grimshaw stood frozen, their scientific minds struggling to process what they were witnessing. Sister Selene began to pray, her whispered words creating a counterpoint to the overwhelming energy in the room. But Zephyra showed no fear. She sat calmly in her bed, surrounded by her drawings, and met the plague doctor's gaze directly. "He did what needed to be done," she answered before Father Salvatore could speak. "He showed that the old laws can evolve." The war nurse moved forward, her form flickering between a modern military uniform and ancient battlefield garb. "Child, you cannot comprehend the forces you're dealing with. The balance must be maintained." "But what if the balance isn't what you think it is?" Zephyra challenged, reaching for her drawings. "Look, really look. The shadows aren't just waiting to claim souls. They're trying to heal wounds that death left behind." She held up her portraits one by one, each showing not just the departed, but the connections that remained, the love that transcended the boundary between worlds. The child keeper, whose form carried an aura of eternal youth, stepped closer to examine them. "These are more than images," the child keeper observed, their voice like wind through ancient trees. "They're windows." "Windows into truth," Father Salvatore confirmed, standing despite his weakness. "What Zephyra and I have created, it's not a violation of the old laws, but an evolution of them. A bridge built not just of duty, but of love." The famine saint, whose gaunt form seemed to contain multitudes, spoke next. "Love is dangerous, Brother Cyprian. It makes us forget our purpose." "And that's what truly scares you, isn't it?" Zephyra asked the assembled eternal servants. "Not that the balance will be destroyed, but that it will change. That love might become as powerful a force in death as it is in life." The plague doctor's form solidified momentarily into that of a medieval physician. "You cannot imagine the chaos that could ensue if the boundaries between life and death become too permeable." "But they already are," Father Salvatore countered. "They always have been. We've just been pretending otherwise. What Zephyra and I have created, it's not a destruction of the old ways, but an acknowledgement of what has always been true." Dr. Thanatos Grimshaw, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke up. "In medicine, we have a saying. Sometimes the cure requires us to work with the disease rather than against it. What if grief works the same way? What if instead of trying to help people move past their losses, we help them understand that love continues beyond death? The plague speaker raised their hand, and all other movement in the room ceased. When they spoke, their voice carried the weight of every death they had ever witnessed. You propose a fundamental shift in the order of things, yet they turned to study Zephyra's drawings again. Perhaps the order itself has been seeking to evolve. Outside Mercy Haven Sanctum, the crimson aurora began to pulse in new patterns, as if reflecting the debate taking place within. The crowd below stood in reverent silence, each person feeling, even if they couldn't explain why, that they were witnessing a moment when the very nature of life and death hung in the balance. The plague speaker's words hung in the air of room 1313 like suspended droplets of time. Each being present, mortal and eternal alike, seemed to hold their breath, waiting for what would come next. The crimson aurora outside pulsed with increasing intensity, casting the room in waves of otherworldly light. Evolution, the plague speaker continued, their form shifting through centuries of human history, is not always gentle. The question becomes, is humanity ready for such knowledge? Are they prepared for the responsibility that comes with it? Zephyra rose from her bed for the first time since the exchange, her small frame somehow containing both childish vulnerability and ancient wisdom. The silver in her eyes swirled more prominently as she walked toward the assembled eternal servants. "They already carry that responsibility," she said, her voice echoing with multiple harmonies. "Every person who's ever loved and lost, they carry it. The weight of remembering, of continuing to love even when death stands between them and those they've lost. We're just making visible what they've always known in their hearts." The war nurse stepped forward, her uniform changing from ancient to modern and back again. "And what of those who would abuse such knowledge? Those who would try to force communications, demand more than the dead can give?" "That's why we're here," Father Salvatore responded, standing straighter despite his aged frame. "Not to throw open the doors between worlds, but to guide, to help both the living and the dead understand the new balance." Dr. Nightshade moved to one of the monitors, gesturing at the readings. "Look at these patterns. Even the medical equipment is registering the change. It's as if the very fabric of reality in this hospital has begun to accommodate both worlds." Sister Celine nodded. "The sacred and the secular, the spiritual and the scientific. Perhaps they were never meant to be as separate as we thought." The child keeper knelt before Zephyra, their eternal youth meeting her transformed childhood. "You understand things we have forgotten," they said softly. "In our long service, we became so focused on maintaining boundaries that we forgot why they existed in the first place." "To protect," Zephyra answered, reaching out to touch the child keeper's hand. "But protection doesn't always mean separation. Sometimes it means creating safe spaces for connection." The Stormwatcher turned from the window again. The crowd below, their collective grief, their hope, their love, it creates a power of its own, a force we cannot ignore. Nurse Astraea stepped forward, her medical training giving way to deeper intuition. "Every day in this hospital, we see the intersection of life and death. We've been trying to keep them separate, but maybe that's not what healing really means." The Famine Saint's form solidified briefly. "And what of the balance? The natural order?" "The natural order is love," Callista declared, moving to stand beside her daughter. "Everything else, life, death, grief, hope, they're all just different expressions of it." Suddenly, every light in Mercy Haven Sanctum flickered simultaneously. The shadows in the corners of room 1313 took on definition, revealing countless faces, the accumulated souls of all those who had passed through the hospital's halls. The plague doctor raised their hands, ancient symbols appearing in the air around them. "What you propose? It would require a new covenant, a redefinition of the laws that have governed our service for centuries." "Not a redefinition," Father Salvatore corrected, "an expansion, a recognition that the barriers between life and death have always been more permeable than we admitted. That love has always been the bridge." Zephyra held up her final drawing, a complex mandala showing the interconnected nature of all things, life, death, love, grief, hope, and healing. The image seemed to pulse with its own inner light. "This is what I see now," she explained. "What the exchange showed me. It's not about breaking the old laws, but about understanding that they were always meant to evolve, just as humanity evolves, just as love evolves." The eternal servants gathered closer, their ancient power mingling with the new energy that radiated from Zephyra and Father Salvatore. Outside, the crimson aurora began to shift, bands of gold and silver weaving through the red, as if the very sky was reflecting the possibility of a new covenant between the worlds of the living and the dead. Inside room 1313, all waited for the Plague Speaker's final judgment, knowing that whatever was decided would change not just Mercy Haven Sanctum, but the very nature of how humanity understood its relationship with death and those who had passed beyond the veil. The Plague Speaker raised their ancient hands, and reality itself seemed to hold its breath in room 1313. The shadows that had gathered, countless souls who had passed through Mercy Haven Sanctum over the years, pressed closer, their presence making the air thick with anticipation. For millennia, the Plague Speaker began, their voice carrying the weight of countless deaths and rebirths. "We have served as the guardians of the veil between worlds. We were chosen in humanity's darkest hours to maintain order, to ensure that death remained. Separate, but perhaps." They turned to study Zephyra, who stood unwavering before them, her small frame containing both the innocence of childhood and the wisdom of ages. "Perhaps it is we who have been blind to the true nature of our service." The Plague Doctor stepped forward. "You mean to accept this change? This evolution?" "Look at her drawings," the Child Keeper urged, gesturing to the portraits scattered across Zephyra's bed. "They show what we've forgotten, that death has never been about ending love, but about transforming it." Father Salvatore moved to stand beside Zephyra, his aged face serene despite his weariness. "The exchange we performed didn't violate the old laws. It revealed their true purpose: to guide, to comfort, to help both the living and the dead understand their eternal connection." The war nurse's form shifted, settling into that of a modern medical professional. "And what of Mercy Haven Sanctum? This hospital now stands at the intersection of worlds." "As all hospitals do," Dr. Nightshade interjected. "We've just been too afraid to acknowledge it. Every doctor, every nurse, we've all felt it, the moments when the veil thins, when we know somehow that we're not alone in our work." The Stormwatcher turned from the window one final time. The crowd below has grown larger still. They feel the change, even if they don't understand it. Their presence, their collective hope, it cannot be ignored. "Nor should it be," Sister Celine added softly. "Faith has always taught us that love transcends death. Perhaps it's time we helped people understand exactly what that means." The Plague Speaker raised their hand again, and the crimson aurora outside transformed, shot through with threads of gold and silver that wove themselves into patterns matching Zephyra's mandala. "Then let it be known," they declared, "that a new covenant is formed this night. The old laws remain, but they expand, evolve, to embrace what has always been true: that love is the bridge between worlds, and those who guide such crossings must understand both sides." Zephyra smiled, reaching for her mother's hand. "It means we can help people understand that their loved ones aren't really gone," she explained to Callista. "Just transformed, like the shadows that are really memories given form." The assembled eternal servants moved to form a circle around Zephyra and Father Salvatore. "You two represent something unprecedented," the Plague Doctor acknowledged. "A bridge between the old ways and the new. A balance of youth and age, innocence and wisdom." "Mercy Haven Sanctum will become a beacon," the war nurse added. "A place where the veil remains thin, where healing can happen on both sides of the divide. And you, child," the Child Keeper addressed Zephyra directly, "will help us remember what we've forgotten over the centuries. That our duty is not just to maintain boundaries, but to help love find its way across them. As dawn began to break over Ravencross Vale, the first rays of sunlight merged with the transformed aurora, creating a display that would be remembered for generations. In room 1313, the Eternal Servants bowed their heads in acknowledgement of the new covenant, their ancient power harmonizing with the new energy that Zephyra and Father Salvatore had brought into being. "We will monitor," the plague speaker declared, "but we will also learn. The balance shifts, but perhaps this is how it was always meant to be." As the Eternal Servants began to fade from view, returning to their eternal duties with new understanding, Nurse Astraea looked around the room with fresh eyes. The medical equipment had returned to normal function, but now she understood that normal had been redefined. Dr. Grimshaw cleared his throat. "How do we explain this to the hospital board?" Zephyra laughed, a child's laugh, bright and clear. "We don't explain. We show them. Every time someone finds peace in their grief, every time a dying patient smiles because they can feel their loved ones waiting, that's all the explanation they'll need." Father Salvatore smiled, the new lines in his face seeming less like a burden and more like badges of wisdom earned. "The sun rises on a new era," he said softly. "One where death is not an ending, but a transformation. Where love is recognized as the eternal force it has always been." Outside, the crowd began to disperse, each person carrying with them a sense of change they couldn't quite explain, but would never forget. Inside Mercy Haven Sanctum, the work of healing, both of the living and the dead, continued, but now with a deeper understanding of what healing truly meant. And in room 1313, a young girl with silver-swirled eyes began a new drawing, this one showing the hospital as it truly was. A place where two worlds touched, where love bridged the gap between life and death, and where hope would always find a home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.